consciousness evolves towards an increasingly comprehensive understanding of justice and oneness. This evolution is a dialectic between individual and collective, not simply the sum total of individual evolution. Therefore, as we work toward the evolution of consciousness, it is essential to engage the socio-historical structures that scaffold it. As a great number of people develop a more comprehensive perspective, they lead the way to the creation of new forms of social organization that uphold a more comprehensive understanding of justice. In this way, as socio-historical contexts evolve, they become the containers that scaffold the evolution of collective understanding. With this dialectic in mind, let us look at where we are collectively now. We find ourselves in a massive worldwide awakening to our spiritual reality of interdependence and a growing push towards peaceful governance that reflects and protects that. The call that people of conscience are raising is not just the eternal human longing for peace. It is a very concrete call for governance that protects human security, honors the sanctity of life, and stewards the planet. This is, in effect, a push to the next level of human social organization that can scaffold the path to universal peace. This is our biggest challenge right now, to lead the way and to mobilize all available resources to create the next level of evolutionary global governance. What does that mean? Historically, until now, the power of force has been used to dominate over others. Even as humanity has evolved its understanding of human rights and has advanced greatly in the creation of more just and comprehensive laws, power is still understood as the power to dominate. The history of the gradual creation of the United Nations, conceived as a broad-based and effective system of international security since 1942, itself illustrates how the original bold vision to create an international entity based on federalist principles became hijacked to the interests of sovereign powers. The more ambitious vision of a global order based on international cooperation was reduced at the October 1943 conference in Moscow to what was viewed as a politically feasible and largely harmless organization through the creation of the Security Council veto. Nonetheless, an effort was made to embed within the UN Charter clauses that would allow, at least in theory, for the future strengthening of mechanisms of international cooperation, as circumstances evolved further toward a global vision of world order. 80 years later, as Putin's war in Ukraine and the response of the West have escalated into a confrontation of global powers, it is abundantly clear that the current historical moment calls on us to raise again the vision of a global federalist order and to educate people that it is the only path to justice and security for all. The shift now needed is to radically redefine the use of power. In other words, to create a vehicle to use the power of force only for the right reason, to protect against the rise of dictators who threaten unity of justice and global security. Such a global entity with the power to protect humanity and the planet would represent the next stage in the progressive evolution of collective consciousness and would scaffold the developing understanding of what it means to live in peace, something humanity has no experience with and will have to grow into gradually. In the face of Putin, we have a clear example of what happens when there is no viable international mechanism to stop the rise of bloodthirsty dictators before their grip on power has solidified. Most in his close circle recognize the madness of his war in Ukraine, as more and more reports reveal. But they are powerless to stop him now. And as some of them have declared, they are forced to keep going in silence all the way to The Hague. Collective global security requires the world to be prepared for such circumstances because human nature is capable of extreme evil, and it may be centuries of collective life in global peace before we fully transcend the likelihood of the rise of ruthless dictators. Unitive justice cannot be treated at this time solely as an intellectual ideal. It must be upheld in concrete, practical, and urgent ways. The world must have an entity, a reformed United Nations, capable of protecting ordinary people from being at the mercy of warlords, as millions of Russians are now. Only when the creation and full empowerment of such an entity has been accomplished will people have the socio-historical conditions necessary for the further evolution of consciousness. That was the evolutionary spiritual vision, clearly articulated by Baha'u'llah in the mid-19th century, the transformation of consciousness toward realizing the unity of the human family. To conclude, in asking for the creation of this synergy circle, my vision from the very beginning has been that we unite our individual experience and networks of resources into an in-depth consultation on how we can most effectively support the socio-historical evolutionary process toward unity of justice and global security through broad educational efforts. Humanity is still steeped in a 17th century frame of reference that emphasizes national sovereignty, borders, and nationalist militarism. There is a lot to be done to articulate for people what unity of justice may look like amidst our existential climate and political crises, why it requires a federalist international structure, and how this structure can gradually and effectively subsume the task of the protection of peace and planetary life through a global military force, freeing humanity from military competition in the creation of ever more sophisticated weapons of destruction. To answer the question eloquently articulated by Jonathan Granoff, what is the transformative unifying principle that can be the North Star coming out of the current chaos? As his work clearly articulates, we must educate people toward an understanding of human security rather than national security as the condition for unity of justice. We must also articulate the integrative spiritual principles that underlie unity of justice and human security, and that must become embedded in education on every level. It is no doubt a very complex leap forward that is required of humanity. And it is our challenge to keep articulating a feasible and practical path forward and to become catalysts of this leap.